There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my real top niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please.
Welcome everybody to Voice of Rebellion Radio. This is your host, Chris J, here at UCY.TV. My guest, Cecilly Mcmillan, will be coming from in Arizona to do the show. For people that have been listening to Voice of Rebellion Radio for a long time, yes, we actually had her on, but it was a long time ago, almost 3 years actually, to the week. I believe it was like the first week of August in 2014 that I interviewed her the first time, back when the show was on Stabled Radio exclusively, and the name of the show was actually Revolution Radio at the time. But yes, I was still airing back then, and it's probably the longest elapsed between having a guest and having a guest again. I think, because, I've had a couple of my guests for multiple times, for example, like Rosa Fuller, but, I had her on in 2015, and I had her on later that year, and then I had her on a couple weeks ago. Or no, yeah, I had her on a couple weeks ago. We had technical difficulties, so we ended up replaying that show last week on UCY.TV. The actual interview was done, I think, a few weeks ago. We ultimately, we also have had, like, Sergey Baryshov has came on multiple times, but it's always good to, see where our guests are doing, and Cecilly Mcmillan, people that are not familiar with her case, is that when she was at Occupy Wall Street, a New York Police Department officer grabbed her breast during an altercation, and she elbowed him as a knee-jerk reaction. She was charged with assault, actually, and was sent to jail for, I think it was like 9 months. I'll have to ask her, forget the exact details, and I believe she was sent to Rikers Island Women's Correctional Facility, which she talks a lot about the police brutality inside the prison and the absolute abhorrent nature of how they treat prisoners in that prison and just all across the country. And now we have the private prison industry. It is booming. There's more and more prisons where it's become for profit. Now, I don't believe Rikers Island is a for-profit prison, but it's just one other thing of the whole prison system that so many are for-profit, and they could care less about her rehabilitation. Not even in the mix of this whole conversation. Everybody pretty much knows that jail is not for that and hasn't been for that in a long time. However, it's become more and more about profit. It's becoming really a modern slave industry where you have people working for slave wages inside these private prisons where they make billions of dollars. Private prison industry is a gigantic industry, and you see that we have 25% of the world's prison population, yet we only have 5% of the world's population. So we have a 5-to-1 disproportionate ratio compared to the average around the world. In this country, we have more prisoners in China, we have more prisoners in Russia, we have the most prisoners of any country on the planet, and a lot of it's for nonviolent drug offenses, which ultimately these people should not be sent to prison. They should be sent to rehabilitation. They should be sent and get treated for their addictions. And maybe for the dealers, that's a different story. But however, users a lot of times are thrown in long minimum sentencing years. And for example, we also have discrimination in drug sentencing policies, like we've had in the past, where black people who predominantly used crack were sent to much stiffer sentences than the white people using cocaine in the 80s and 90s during the war on drugs. And the only real difference between the drugs is the potency. And ultimately, you have all these minimum sentencing for crack cocaine, which ended up sending many black people throughout the 80s and 90s into prison for extended periods of time, ultimately feeds into this entire prison industrial complex, which has gotten alarmingly huge in contemporary United States. And as you think that as we're moving forward into the future, that we'd be moving towards a fixing of our prison system. However, we're continuing to move towards more privatization, and now we don't seem to have any real indication that's going to go the other way. And you have other countries where prisoners are not treated unjustly inhumane, like in Norway and their countries. They're trying to rehabilitate criminals. Now, I definitely agree that their sentences. There's definitely crimes out there that people should rot in prison and do their time, and by time their entire lives in prison. There's obvious cases of this, and but when it comes to minor crimes, or when it comes to nonviolent drug offenses, like I mentioned, people who are addicted, this is very sick, because you're throwing people that are sick, that have addictions to heroin, have addictions to cocaine, whatever drug it is, and you're making them suffer even worse by throwing them in prison, instead of trying to help these people that have a serious disease and addiction. Which, again, there's people who say that that's not even a real thing. It's all, no, it's an illness, and it needs to be treated like an illness by our correctional system, not by throwing them in jail, people who are addicted to drugs. And this is one more symptom of our prison industrial complex that we're living in, is that we have so many people. I mean, what is it, 50% of our prisons are filled with people that are nonviolent drug offenses? Well, anyways, I'm going to divert here because it looks like my guest has got here. So I'm going to put her into the studio right now. Hey, how's it going?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome back. It's been, almost 3 years. I think it was like August 3rd of 2014 when you last came on. It was back then we called it Revolution Radio, but we made some brand changes since then. It's now Voice Rebellion Radio. And by the way, we're at a bigger station now. We're at Stable Radio right now, but this is also replayed at UTY.TV at Sunday, 9 o'clock Eastern, by the way, all the listeners out there. If you don't catch all the show, you can catch it later on YouTube. Just look up Voice Rebellion Radio and it'll pop up. I was just pretty much describing who you were and what I remember what happened in New York. I think it'd be better for you to actually tell the story yourself, because it's been kind of a while since we talked. I kind of forgot a few of the details, but I think it's always best to get the first step out there. So, I guess that's a great way to start the show. Let's talk about the original incident that landed you with the assault charges and eventually brought you up to be one of the most well-known occupiers in America.
Well, I guess on March 17th, 2012, it was the 6-month anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And there was a celebration planned at Zuccotti Park. And I had planned to sit that one out. Pretty much, I'd been involved in Occupy Wall Street almost every day since having come to New York. The August beforehand, August 2011, in the planning stages. And I had stopped by the park only briefly that evening in order to pick up some friends. I was actually celebrating St. Patrick's Day as a Mcmillan, and having had visitors come in from out of town to spend the holiday with me. And I was there for all of about 15 minutes when I heard an announcement to clear the park. And while trying to, head towards an exit, more or less, try to find my friends so that we could go together, I could not find them. And on my way out of the park, I was grabbed from behind, pulled up backwards by the breast, and then slammed face first into the concrete, and that's kind of the last that I remember that evening. But as it turns out, 6 officers, the person who had grabbed me was a New York City Police Department officer, and 6 of his friends, approximately half a dozen of his friends, had kicked and beat me into what appears to have been a grand mal seizure, a brain-damaging seizure. And they let me seize 14 to 17 minutes in handcuffs, and then disappeared me for 40 hours, and then put me in a storage closet and Bellevue psych ward. And when I emerged, I was charged with felony assault of an officer, and on the grounds that Anonymous had gotten involved while I was in jail, they tried to insinuate that I was a domestic terrorist and tried to charge me $50,000 bail. Luckily, that wasn't the case. I had no priors. I was a teacher certified, and Jimmy Carter's great-grandson's former nanny. So it's pretty absurd, but I'd been targeted for a number of months by that point and had already suffered a really violent beating beforehand, so I think it was probably a targeted arrest.
And why do you say it was a targeted arrest? What were you involved in before?
As I said, I had been targeted several times before that. Whenever I would participate in other actions or whatever, someone would always come up to me, a journalist or otherwise another activist, and say, they know who you are, they're gunning for you. And I think I had been sort of in the news months before that. My first, actually, a lot of people don't know that I was really violently arrested a time before that. It was profiled in the Rolling Stone magazine when I'd had a shoulder dislocated and a couple ribs cracked while trying to do a human barricade on to actually take over the financial district. I guess from that moment on, coupled with the work I was doing with union leadership, I had gotten a lot of attention as sort of a main participant as the demands working group sort of leader. And I don't know, I was getting a lot of traction, I guess, in the media. And the group I was working with was getting a lot of traction in the media. And it seemed to maybe be heading somewhere in Occupy Wall Street. So I think there was a threat there, maybe. But also, I think I was targeted maybe as a woman. 23 other women were grabbed in the same way that I was grabbed across the course of Occupy Wall Street by a tactic that was suspended in 2001 by the NYPD, because it's called a seatbelt grab. So you grab someone from one hip across the body towards the opposite shoulder, and it's essentially, its main use is to apprehend a subject while in motion, essentially to knock them off balance, but it would obviously require you to sexually assault a woman, hence the reason it was banned. However, after the pepper spraying, the baloney pepper spraying, from that point forward, it is interesting that 23 cases against women in Occupy Wall Street arose, in which male officers were sexually assaulting women, it seems, in an effort to get them, to deter them from participating. One, the same very night that occurred that I was assaulted, Cressa, she was attacked in the same manner, and I struck a deal with the city to the tune of $90,000. So settled out of court.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, a lot of what law enforcement does and what the military overseas to do is psychological, and to, the way that these women were grabbed, it was it's a psychological attack. It's like you said, to deter them from protesting, and and the thing about law enforcement nowadays is that, and really throughout all of history, I mean, there's people that will try to say there was a time where it was all rainbows and sunshine, and that police acted morally and actually cared about the community. It was true that maybe back in the day they had more of a personal connection with the community, and they weren't so much of drones for the state. However, nowadays it seems that they are becoming more and more just enforcers to try to keep this country from any kind of mass uprising against the elite that they're protecting, the super rich that are currently in control of this country. And Occupy Wall Street was a real threat to the top. It was finally a time where Americans in masses had rose up and demanded that Wall Street be held accountable for the crimes against the American people and against people worldwide. And it was maybe the biggest uprising we had seen since the late 60s or the early 70s, when we had the Vietnam War protests that actually did lead to the government being forced to leave Vietnam eventually. I mean, a lot of the pressure, I mean, if it wasn't for America's saying no to Vietnam, probably America would have stayed in Vietnam until now. We would have made bases, everything like they did with Afghanistan. But because of the public pressure, we were able to stop that from happening, and the war ended. Not the greatest result, but it could have been a lot worse. This was an uprising almost of that scale in some ways. You know, we had on September 17, 2011, how many people were at Cecilly Park? It was a gigantic and spontaneous thing, too. It seemed like it came out of pretty much nowhere, at least to the main street. So I think that's why they tried so hard to eliminate Occupy Wall Street leaders and to dismantle the movement altogether.
And women were particularly sympathetic. The public was particularly sympathetic towards women, and it was very clear in the several times that women were put forth in the news, etc., beaten or stripped or, pepper sprayed. That I think it was clear there that it was a nonviolent movement, and that the police are the only ones responding violently. And so I think that, there is a big push to more or less remove women from the circumstance, which is also true of the 60s. I mean, it's very iconic, I Can't Dance is not my revolution, and there's the women putting flowers in the barrel of guns, certainly it is a negative thing that women are socialized to have to take on softer qualities or more communicative qualities or more collaborative qualities, and they're often kept from being in positions of power because they're seen that way. But on the other hand, I think women activists today are using that sort of socialized negation of their power in a very powerful way, and making movements more palatable, I guess. They're really turning that entire paradigm on its head and, building a lot of power from a seemingly powerless position.
I was going to move on to another question, is that, there's been many cases where we've seen absolutely horrid things being done to protesters, and the multiple protests have happened in the last 5 to 6 years. We've had the one with Mike Brown protest in Ferguson. We had the protest in Baltimore. We've had pretty big protesting events the last few years, actually. And there's been also some pretty bad things that happened to the protesters on behalf of the law enforcement federal agents. But a lot of them have went underreported and never made it to big magazines. Like, I believe your story got into, like you said, the Rolling Stones, Cosmopolitan, and a few other magazines. What do you think was able to, or case, more light and more exposure than some of these other protesters that mainly remained a Facebook story, that just, or on alternative media, but never got to quite to the mainstream media?
Well, there is nothing sort of accidental about the way my story progressed in the media. I had a very strong political family, more or less, called the Cadre, where there's a group of about 10 or 12 of us, ranging from 18 years old to 32, of some of the best and brightest political activists and burgeoning political activists out there in New York City. And we did a lot of study together, a lot of practice together. We spent probably 20, 25, 30 hours a week together training and studying, doing reading groups, doing direct action training, realistic direct action training, media training, working in coalition with other groups like the IWW and LGBTQ groups on NYU and the student bloc and, students attempting to unionize and unions and Peace Initiative. And we worked with how to organize like a party, just like a social event that would bring people across, the spectrum, political spectrum together, and from anarchists to Democrats to sit down and just see each other's people. We did a lot of media studies. We talked a lot about our activism, our values, like what we saw as radical and what we saw as militant, and our views on nonviolence, and really spent day in and day out together for 6 to 8 months before the trial came to fruition. And we really built a niche in the media up front, in the sense that, everything from my getting my hair blown out and, really whitewashing my look, like really getting the news to pay attention to this idea that there was like radical terrorists trying to dismantle the government versus the person that I looked like, versus the very similar backgrounds that I came from, the fact that I had run political campaigns and been on path to become a teacher. And, really, I guess, exacerbated this idea that, which is true, that the occupier isn't the deviant. They're very close to the center of millennial American politics today, and really showcasing that in a way that we hoped would redefine for the public what the word activist conjured up in terms of an image. But on my side of things, too, I was prepared. I don't think most of the team was. I wanted to show that no matter how much privilege you have, if you dare to stand up for people of color, if you dare to stand up for the poor, the disenfranchised, then you will get treated like one. And I wanted to show a little bit of the reality that the other side faces every day, that even with all of these resources, you can't get a fair trial if you're standing up against the 1%. So I guess, we had a lot of resources because we organized them up front, and we talked to lawyers, we talked to activists, we did our homework, and we figured out what branding and imaging worked. But none of it was happenstance, and that's a lot of privilege, man. It takes a lot of privilege to be able to have this kind of resources.
So that's the unfortunate reality about a lot of the people that are in the activist community in America and that protest, is that they don't have many resources at all. They have a lot of these people are lower class or maybe lower middle class that are out in protest. They don't have, and then when the media goes out to discredit them, it's hard for them to disprove the image that the media can create. And the media is so powerful that even with all those privileges, and all those resources that you can use, I mean, you see this even happen to people that have all that stuff. Like, for example, you might not be the biggest fan of him, and I'm actually not the biggest fan of him either, really, for his economic policies. But the last honest congressman that I think that America might have had was Ron Paul, and you see the way that they the media as a man that he wasn't. They didn't show that he was a doctor in the 50s that would give service to African Americans that were too poor in Texas to afford their medical care because of the segregationist policies of the time in the South. But no, they would highlight comments here and there where he made mistakes and said things that were wrong to say.
Howard Dean, yeah. I mean, someone that was so excited about participating in politics, someone who actually literally made very few mistakes in his political career, who was destroyed just for being excited enough about running for office to woo about it.
I forget, what year did he run? Was it 2004 that he ran?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah,
but, I mean, beyond that, it's I mean, the thing is, I mean, what Cadre tried to do and what we have since sort of in a very rough format affected is sort of a kit or a toolbox for crowdsourcing court support. And, I think I've made myself very much available towards helping in that capacity, set people up with lawyers or advising on PR. But it's also really hard because people kind of want to believe the myth. Everybody only pays attention to her because she's a white girl. Well, A, I'm not white. B, I'm not rich. C, I didn't grow up in this society. I probably knew so much about the court systems because I come from a family of all felons. All of my family is felons for having, been involved with drugs, mostly in behalf of their station in life. And ultimately, whereas it's a nice thought to think that anybody would just care about someone because they look like a nice girl, but it's simply not true. When I try to explain to people about the process that it takes, how much I had to sort of brand myself, how much of myself I had to sort of lose in order to become someone who others would care about. And I tell them how jarring of a process that is. It's something that they have a hard time getting, and beyond that, they don't like to hear that almost never does the media want to be your friend, exactly what you just said. I explained, doing court support, being a defendant for a political trial is kind of like Gladiator. And newspapers are kind of like the person holding up thumbs up or thumbs down, and the mass wants a story, the best possible story. And it's so rare that the best possible story is that this person is innocent. That's not normally an interesting story, and you have to figure out how to make it interesting. And I think there's a lot of entitlement out there where people are just but this is the right thing. And it's you have to understand that we're not living in a world where the right thing prevails. How is it so hard for you to understand? And so I've been helping out, or trying to be of assistance to the J20 folks right now. And, it's hard to explain to people that this is kind of not a thing that you want to be a consensus-based project. It has to be a top-down, very clear, who's in charge of what and where and what you're saying. Because if you're just trying to do sort of crowd-sourced court support with no top-down initiative, with no chain of command, you're looking at probably doing more harm to these people than help. A bad media story will run its course, and that'll probably be out. It's, yesterday's news. But if you have people who continue to sort of fuel the flames and don't know what they're doing, things can go bad very quickly.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, media, as we've seen with multiple different things in the recent years, when it comes to the big three media, it doesn't matter what you watch. If you watch Fox, CNN, MSNBC, you're being lied to for the agenda of the people that are in charge of the United States. And, all of it, and the thing is that's weird is that they're lying from three different perspectives. It's like you watch MSNBC is to cater to your more so-called, the more liberal audience of America, and they get their set of lies. You got CNN gets the down the middle or slightly left-leaning, I guess, what we call the left, even though it's not really the real left. And then you have Fox, which is just like the right, rural people of America will be mainly watching that, and they get their own set of lies, and it keeps everybody divided. It keeps everyone fighting amongst each other, and it prevents any kind of real working class, middle class unity in this country because everyone has been fit into their own. I was like, oh, I'm a liberal, so I can't agree with you, conservative. Oh, you're a conservative. Ultimately, the American political system, as it is, and how I see it, is that everything is to the right. If you look at the world compared to America, is that we don't have the variety of political parties that many other countries have. I mean, ultimately, you look at the issue between the Democrats and Republicans, it's all the economic stuff's practically the same. It's just like how badly do we want to fuck poor people? Is it going to be slightly or a little bit worse? Or that's more like really bad or really, really bad? Seems to be the debate that goes on in Washington, D.C. And when it comes to these social issues, is that it feels like they pull a few here and there and they distract the people and keep people arguing about stuff. Like I see, some story, like for example, they'll be talking about, it's like, oh, is the Confederate flag racist? It goes on for 3 hours about that. And then in the bottom, we talk about how the United States entered into another illegal war over the weekend and killed 100 civilians. It's like, I think that singing the scroll is a little bit more important about a piece of cloth. I don't know. Or they'll be like, burning the American flag should be allowed or something like that. Like every year around July 4th, one of those comes out. It's like, oh, somebody urinated on the American flag. What do you think about that? It makes a big outrage. People are distracted about that for a few days on the internet. And ultimately, the real stories go right over their heads about, the Federal Reserve corruption, which the entire institute's corrupt.
Pieces of Antarctica breaking off.
Gigantic stories, or we had another illegal war we got into, another coup that we were involved in, stuff like that. Just it goes right over people's heads. I
think that the way to get at this, like most importantly, is whether it's raising a Confederate flag, burning the American flag, like shouting hate speech against LGBTQ communities at burials, or shouting hate speech at soldiers' burials. Like the point is like, is it always nice, respectful? No. But is it freedom of speech? Yes. And if you just draw a hard line on that, you just draw a hard line in the sand on that, then A, we have a protected civil liberty, and B, it ceases to be a story. It's like, yeah, that person's a total dick, but that's their right.
Well, it seems more and more America's becoming. It's the weird thing is that we're combining stuff from Nazi Germany when it comes to like our military machine that we've created and the jingoistic nature that many Americans have adopted. But at the same time, we also adopted things from like the Soviet Union, like their how they were known for their suppression of freedom of speech. It's like, oh no, that's not approved by the party of the Soviet Union, so you can't say that. You can't say that. Oh yeah, by the way, we're erecting a wall apparently. I mean, nobody sees the irony of that just 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, the big thing is that we were celebrating a wall coming down over in Europe, and now we're going to build one of our own on the Mexican border. I mean, America's, the funny thing is how short of a memory, or maybe just the fact that we don't learn from history. And
I think it's American exceptionalism, too.
I think that wrong when
we really
do it.
Cannot see ourselves. Yeah. We can't see ourselves in the trajectory of Germany, right? Which is nuts. Some would argue that we have gone, way past, from slavery to Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow. The way that we have been putting people routinely in ICE detention centers, forcing them to work, illegally forcing them to work, to do jobs that they came over here to do for money, mind you, and forcing them to go through the whole season before they send them back, quote, to their homes, even though some people had never even had, a memory of a living in those countries. What we did to the Japanese, internment camps, I don't know if it's just that Americans aren't educated, like you said, or they're choosing to not make the connections, or they're choosing to believe that we're somehow morally superior. But it is absurd. It's really absurd.
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. Partially, yes, it's that American people are no longer educated. There used to be a lot better education system, I think, back in, maybe 50 years ago or such, if you lived in the right part of the country and you're white. But we did have, I guess, for some people, a better education system. Now everybody, the whole education system seems to be crumbling. And in fact, we're falling down with countries like Estonia and Vietnam when it comes to what our public schools are rated as. So that's definitely not good. And they're being taught a whitewashed version of American history, as where shows that the Americans always as the victors and always as the liberators and many other things. Like example, World War II is that they show us that the ultimate victor and the ultimate person of right and wrong, that we were right in the war. We defeated the Nazis practically single-handedly when the Russians practically did. 90% of the victory was the Russians.
We barely got in.
They could have beat us. They could have beat them without us. They did almost all the work on the Eastern Front. We didn't get in until 1943 in Italy, which was a disaster. And then when we finally got a D-Day, that's the little bit of work we did in Europe was there. We did a lot of work against the Japanese, but when it came to the Nazis themselves, and it's one of our crowning achievements that we're told at school is that we defeated the Nazis. We defeated the most evil country that you can possibly imagine. But no, that was mainly the Russians who did that. And then the funny thing is that they don't talk about how just a few years later, we started importing all these Nazis and former German officials into our government, and also we helped countries that were sympathetic to these countries that accepted those war criminals. For example, we helped Klaus Barbie in Bolivia capture Che Guevara just in 1967, who still had a Nazi sympathies and actually had his own paramilitary wing down there. I forget what was the exact name of the group, but it was pretty much a paramilitary they ran of pretty much neo-Nazis in the 1960s all the way up to the 1980s. We actually utilized his help once again in 1980 to depose a Democratic elected government in Bolivia that America wasn't too friendly with. And yeah, we actually used his help twice to eliminate Che Guevara and another government there in Bolivia. And there's other examples of this collusion, like Adolf Husinger going from Nazi chief of staff to become a NATO chief of staff. And I guess it was easy for him because, hey, I'm going from fighting Russians as a German official, now I'm going to fight Russians from a NATO official in Washington, D.C. in the same position. I just have to change my office, and now my forms come in English. It's ultimately our version of history that Americans have been taught from all throughout, even in college level, is so whitewashed, and I think that's a huge part of it. And also, right now, and again, it's like the American exceptionalism comes with protests as well, is that protests are right when it happened in other countries, like, oh, they're fighting against the dictator. Oh, they're that country, for example, and they don't know anything about the political situation there. They know about the political situation here, but they're automatically going to say, oh, those political protesters are a bunch of violent punks. Oh, those political protesters they're just terrorists, or you hear about Black Lives Matter, people quick to label them as domestic terrorists. Oh, they're just rioting and stealing shit, that kind of stuff.
Well, I do think that on the flip side of this, not that I am at all in support of the messaging of the Proud Boys or, previously the Tea Party or anything like that. However, again, towards, the value of freedom of speech. If you're going to have those views and that you're going to have those values, or whatever, I do prefer that you come forward and you exercise them in the plane of peaceful assembly, peaceable assembly, as, the rest of us, in the sense that when those viewpoints are out there, like, we can address them. We can have a conversation. When it's insidious and it's ingrained and it's, like, deeply held and people are in segregated communities, there cannot be beyond that. I think one undeniable value to some of the millennial youth who hold, opposite our views, getting out there and protesting, et cetera, is it does disallow people, especially on the right and the conservative side, to sort of say protesters are terrorists, right? Because then you have their side coming out, and we know historically, though again it's not taught, some of the most violent aggressors in history have been protesters of the right, the KKK. It's like, you want to talk about a violent insurrectionist group, it's like more bombings and more shootings went off through the KKK than you could ever attribute to probably the Black Panthers, the Weather Underground, and Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street combined. Any of that. But it's such a place where people have such a short-term memory of things. I mean, arguably the most heinous terrorist group in American history was the KKK.
Yeah, it's also, that's what also you see a lot of the, talk about a lot of the memory loss, I guess, that Americans seem to suffer from, or is the false equivalency that people like to make. So I just love when people say, "Oh yeah, the Black Panthers were the Black Panthers just like the Black KKK," which no, they weren't. The KKK
They're
were
on the
a group,
defense, not on the offense. For one.
Yes, exactly.
For two, they were involved in far more than the few instances of actual legitimate violence that can actually be documented and claimed by the Black Panthers. Like, very few. A lot of it staged. A lot of it, totally fabricated on behalf of the FBI. But of the few circumstances, hundreds and hundreds of community programs, mostly to do with giving milk to children and helping Black folks to get jobs in a white economy.
Yes. By the way, I saw you caller. I didn't catch your area code, but the caller that just had their hand up. If you want to call back in, you can. I'll let you in a few minutes. But I did see you there. The Black Panther Party was generally, in my opinion, just a self-defense party that had the community organizing, and they actually helped feed people of all ethnic backgrounds in their communities. And I don't feel the same about the new Black Panther Party. It's a whole different thing. I'm kind of familiar with them. But the old Black Panther Party, the one of Huey P. Newton, this is what we're talking about. And people loved, a lot of the internet geniuses. I don't know. Internet trolls, I guess, could say. Love to say that they'll always, whenever something positive about the Black Panthers or something comes up, they'll try to compare them to the KKK. And obviously, there's two major differences in what type of groups they were, and that's ultimately there seems to be a kind of a disconnect when it comes to, I guess you could say some of the left wing protesting groups throughout the years that they try to compare them to maybe violent groups that they have no connection to. And ultimately, the KKK was a domestic terrorist group that never got classified as a domestic terrorist group, believe it or not, and it's still not a domestic terrorist group.
Yeah. It was absolutely a domestic terrorist. It was probably the most fierce, unchecked, damaging, destructive, most bombing, most shooting, most lynching. I mean, the lives taken by the KKK en masse and the hundreds of thousands of members, I mean, it's shocking. It's shocking. I mean, it's like comparable to like an ISIS on our territory, like that was more or less like completely sanctioned, if not ignored by the government.
You know what was the difference, though, between like some rogue terrorist group and the KKK is that the KKK had people in the government in the KKK.
That's what I mean, yeah. Extensive leadership. They had leadership in the KKK.
They would never be brought down because the government and the KKK were tied together. And in fact, it was shown in I don't know how true it was, but I think it was an anonymous leak or a wiki link that like 2 Republican congressmen belonged to the KKK or something like that. I'm not going to say it as fact, but I'm going to say that it would not totally surprise me when it comes to just the absolute nut house that our government is. The congressmen, some of these people that are in Congress, some of these people that are in Senate, of both sides, they honestly, I don't see how they could get a job anywhere, nevertheless being the people writing our laws. I mean, I don't see how they can really get hired to working the graveyard shift at a 7-Eleven.
I mean, yeah, and when we talk about that as compared to the Black Panther Party, it's like that iconic photo of the Black Panther Party standing with guns, on the steps of the courthouse. Like, people don't really contextualize what that was, and what that was, we studied, the cadre studied, actually, as a measure of court support. Obviously, we chose not to engage in that particular strategy, but it was essentially a defensive mechanism attempting to get the courts to legitimately confront a defendant. That's all that was. They had weapons there in order to get the court system to do what the court system was supposed to do for every citizen of the United States. And the fact that they had to show up with weapons in order to try to get the court system to just be fair, to just be legitimate, to not disappear someone, to not just do a show trial. That's what they were doing there that day. They weren't like trying to overthrow the government. They were trying to get the government to fairly articulate itself towards black folks in the same way that it does for white folks. Well, and the fact that they had to resort to such extreme measures shows the extreme disparity.
Well, that's a problem that I find on ultimately a lot of liberals in America, and I'll say it is that a lot of liberals in America have this disconnect and will deem the Black Panthers violent because of their use of firearms in self-defense. And in my opinion, is that I believe that there's nothing inherently, it's like there seems to be this idea of liberals in the United States that firearms are like immediately conservative or right-wing. No, is that workers have used firearms many times in order to correct unjust moves by whatever people that were oppressing them, and sometimes has led to, I'm not like calling for violent revolution right here, but I'm saying that workers have used them to bring justice to the lower class or to oppressed and marginalized groups in the past. But there seems to be this disconnect right now in America where certain stuff that has nothing to do with like political affiliation is being like tied into that. For example, is that guns are being automatically tied to the right wing, and like legal marijuana is automatically being connected to the left wing. I've noticed this recently. I think it's a thing that I think went on for many, many years in America, is connecting political stuff that doesn't really have a left or right connection. And ultimately, that's what a lot of what's going on right now is everybody wants to fit something to label. Oh, that's conservative, that's liberal, that's fascist, that's communist. When ultimately, why can't we just call things for what they are? Like what happened there, is ultimately just trying to get justice. And that's another thing, is that people don't even take stuff into context. Is that back then you had to go to very extreme measures to make courts do what they did or what they should do in the South. Is that this is a time where they were trying to make sure that black people couldn't even vote And to this day, still cases like this happen. I mean, that's why they're talking about, new civil rights movement. I totally agree that that's what people are pushing for, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, you see the cases with the police brutality, and you see the cases of obviously still institutional racism, and just ultimately it's institutional problems to everybody to a certain degree. It's the state versus the citizens, and our government is becoming more and more out of control. I
think, the issue you bring up is a matter of, it is difficult for culturally privileged and especially white, economically stable liberals to imagine any circumstance in which they would have to assert their rights by a level of militarism that would include guns. Because when you have the privilege to not have to fight for your rights, it's hard to imagine a situation in which you would. And, I talk about my very staunch principles of nonviolence for myself being a very personal journey of having come from a very violent, impoverished background, one of transitional homelessness, one of growing up in an all-white town next to a sundown town, being Mexican and not being allowed to even speak my language or even know what Mexican really was on my mother's side. I all the way up to being able to go to a top-tier liberal arts college and then graduate school at a private school in New York. And I talk about my own personal journey being one of privilege. I have the privilege and I have the dignity to not have to physically fight for my rights. And so when those rights are taken from me without a fight and by force, that sort of privilege and that sort of responsibility is shown as a juxtaposition to the force of wrongful doing on behalf of our state. And so, it's very clear that, a black person taking a beating for his or her rights is just called everyday life. A white person taking a beating against his or her rights is called a protest. And that is a privileged, it is a privilege to be able to have a country look at you in shock and awe because the police beat you up and denied you your rights. But the reason why we do that is because there are whole groups in our society who don't even have the privilege to be given those rights to begin with to be taken away. They just get beaten up every day.
Well, ultimately, yeah, there's a lot, and I hear this a lot too, that people will try to say that, well, I just don't get involved in politics. It doesn't interest me or it doesn't concern me. That's ultimately a very privileged thing to say, is that there's a lot of people
that's a very active stance, yeah.
There's a lot of people that ultimately it's going to affect. There's marginalized groups in society, the poor, the movements the government do all the time, and ultimately it's going to affect everybody at some point.
It does. It's a very active stance. I think negligence is the worst position. I'd rather you be a Proud Boy than not have a position. Because you're just supporting the work that the Proud Boys are doing. In silence.
There's a lot of people that ultimately, it's just apathy, that they just do not care about politics and they just want to stay out of it. But ultimately, this is the worst time. This is the worst time made in American history to stay out of politics. I just feel like all decisions are becoming more and more magnified as we get closer. There seems to be some kind of, I've been talking about this on the radio for a while, and some people will call me an alarmist, but I think we're at a breaking point, for multiple things: economic ruin, with the potential of our dollar going into the gutter, as many economists have predicted. Once the petrodollar is no longer being used to trade in oil, which is already in process. We have also right now, as America gets more and more involved in Syria, even though right now we're kind of in a detente with Syria because of we had the kind of a little bit of a peace talk with Russia, but however, I can imagine very soon they'll be finding another way to meddle in Syria. I mean, they said they're done arming the rebels, but I doubt that's far from over. So there's so many big decisions that could lead to just absolutely cataclysmic type events for our country. This is like this presidency, this administration right now is going to mark the coming of many major things, and I feel this is not even the first time this happened. This is as the history repeats itself, it's just in a different country. That I feel like the torch has been passed. We're the military power of the world. Britain used to be that. Before them, Spain, and all throughout history, it's the same bankers, even the same families have been in charge of the Western world pretty much. And now we're the military arm to defend those people, but however, we're crumbling in the same fashion and in a quicker fashion than those two prior powers that I mentioned. And when that happens, it's going to be a very big ordeal for everyone who lives in America, not just the people that people feel like would be affected. That people are like, well, I'm just a normal guy, so there's nothing. Politics doesn't concern me. But just when.
Well, I mean, what you're saying then is like when people say politics doesn't concern me, or politics is something that doesn't interest me, or I don't want to get involved in politics. What people are saying effectually is people's lives don't concern me. I don't want to get involved in people's suffering. Other people's suffering is something that doesn't matter to me or doesn't affect me. And what they're doing is tacitly consenting to the status quo that destroys, rapes, and kills millions of lives. And that has an effect not only, like you said, in the United States, but now that we exist as not just a superpower, we're the hyperpower, We're the essential, military strong arm of the world. Then if we can't even treat our own citizens with dignity and afford them the basic rights given to us, all of us, our citizenry, by the Constitution, and if we can't treat others living in our country with basic dignity, then what does it say about everyone else in the world? It's such a really strong precedent for how we're going to treat others the world over.
Yeah, and it's already been shown in the wars that we fought in World War II is that as badly as Americans sometimes treat our own soil, it's absolutely despicable how little regard there's been for human lives in other countries. In Korea, civilians were targeted. It wasn't accidental. They were targeted. And I believe they still are targeted in instances in wars for the psychological effect. I believe in Vietnam, that's what happened, and that's why we had the horrible massacres like the My Lai massacre, with 400 civilians were massacred by the United States military, and multiple other instances where napalm were dropped on innocent civilians, and nowadays we're seeing drone strikes, decimating entire blocks by our United States. I almost cringe, calling it our military. It's their military. It's the elite's military. They don't represent us, the American people. It's not our interest. They're not fighting for our freedom, because our freedoms continue to erode. If really the war on terrorism was about our freedom, the terrorists fucking won, because our freedom's eroding every day when they pass a new bill to spy on you. NADA 2012, where they can detain you indefinitely for interest of national security, as they call it. There's only 12 countries in recent history that have had indefinite detention, and it was like the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Nazi Germany. Practically, we're doing stuff that was only on par with dictatorships, not with first world countries, and definitely not with first world democratic countries. That we try to call ourselves that, even though that all the time I hear a statistic that they'll say we're the worst in industrialized countries in this statistic, like infant mortality. Many different statistics were like this on. And I'm like, wait a minute, if we're like the worst of all the first world countries in multiple different statistics that would indicate that we're a first world country, doesn't that mean we're not really a first world country? I mean,
yeah. I mean, one would think, especially when it comes to education.
Well, education, we're down with, like I said, I think we're literally like 26 or 27. We're down with countries like Estonia and Vietnam, which, I mean, Vietnam had to recover from.
Our literacy rates are ridiculously low. Yeah.
Yeah, and our literacy in this country, you have a lot. I live in Florida. That's where I went to school, and that's where I've lived my entire life practically. So this is actually one of the worst states. Like, this is like 47, I think, out of the states in the United States, out of the states in America. And that literacy is definitely one of the things that I could tell that is not the whole way they teach it, I guess, or the whole result is just absolutely abysmal at times. You have people that are graduating high school that barely could read past like a fourth grade level. This is not how it should be. There should be. It definitely leaves people to be told lies, and they won't be able to critical think or be able to read to an extent to actually be able to debunk that.
Participate in democracy for certain.
Yes.
When you can't read, when you can't speak up for yourself, when you can't write, when you can't really become politically literate, then you can't really participate, as every citizen is guaranteed a right to do so. Allegedly.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. I'm going to kind of divert, though. I want to go to a little bit different, because it's a question about activism as a whole. When it comes to activism now, there seems to be a lot of divide even inside of different activists in this country. And again, it goes back to like the whole left-right paradigm, I guess you could say, is that you have a lot of people protesting the government, really, when you break it down to its simplistic nature. But they're protesting the government from different political angles. You have like Occupy Wall Street, which a lot of people would deem as more of a left-wing movement, even though I would deem it really just as a people's movement. It was neither left or right. I believe working class and just people in general were coming from many different political perspectives to Occupy Wall Street. And you've had the protests against police brutality that generally have been deemed more left-wing. And then you have some protests like, I interviewed actually one of the guys from the Bundy Ranch, and I believe that they were protesting government overreach. There was nothing racial. There was nothing, like, the media was trying to claim all these ridiculous things about the Bundy militia. Yes, there were definitely some undesirable characters inside of the Bundy militia occupation, but the general thing that they were protesting was the government overreach of land there in Burns, Oregon, and prior to that, Bunkerville, Nevada. In fact, my former co-host, Vince Easley, he was not actually there. He was actually at Bunkerville, but not like with part of the occupying. He had visited the ranchers, and I don't think he ever made it out to Burns, Oregon, but he's the one that pretty much brought the guy from Burns to my show. Do you think that that's the big thing that's what's active? The big dilemma right now is that there's a political division, or do you really do believe more like we need to be very specific? We have to be specific in what we demand, and this idea of a general activist movement is not a reality, if you catch what I'm saying.
I think we are at an activist moment in history which sort of precedes any socialist movement. I mean, if you look at what directly preceded, the civil rights movement with Brown v. Board, at the same time you have attempts to integrate the army, you have a massive pacifist movement as well in World War II. You have women's rights, right? Like women's health rights coming up at the same time. Women trying to have a sexual revolution in the 50s and 60s. Kids trying to have a free speech movement in the 60s. I mean, when you have these moments that citizens become, and not just citizens, I mean, there was an immigrants' rights movement that came out at the same time, farmers, etc. When you have people rising up, claiming greater powers or agency or authority or legitimacy within our government, others follow suit. Others say, hey, yeah, and us too, on this issue. And this is kind of like this thing. I think and that's the beauty of a social movement, right? It's something that really takes the people and the culture. It leads to a culture of higher participation for a variety of groups. And I don't think we're there right now. I do think we're in the precursors. But, I mean, of course, I think that a democracy works better generally when its constituency is clearly articulating their qualms outright en masse to the government. And whether that's like, I don't think that we should have illegal immigrants, which is something I don't believe in, obviously, but I don't believe people can be illegal, obviously. But whether that's, I don't believe we should have illegal immigrants because they're stealing our jobs. And then you have the unions who are like, you're outsourcing our jobs to foreign investors. You should keep the jobs here. And then you have women that are like, we don't have access to sexual health rights like birth control or abortion. So we're being forced to have children that we can't take care of because you don't have any jobs, right? Then there starts to become a through line, right? Jobs are clearly an issue. And there becomes a moment where you can start having people who would never work together, right? Because it's not like all unions are all that progressive. You've got a lot of really conservative union workers out there, xenophobic union workers, right? And it's not like all women are going to get along with the immigrant population that tends to have, especially when they come from Latin America, they have more conservative religious views, or they tend to, right? So that's going to be an issue. But the point is it starts to force folks to put things that they disagree on aside to sort of see the bigger picture and to work together. And I think right now what we're doing as a society is carving out which constituencies will soon be at the table to negotiate the rise of the next social movement, which I believe will be something akin to a poor people's movement.
Now, so you were talking, prior to a large socialist movement. This is what this moment is right now. Do you consider yourself to be a socialist?
Actually, I'm a communist when it really comes down to it. And I don't mean like a member of the Communist Party. I mean, communism has to do with both economic policies and political policies. And if it comes right down to it, I mean, I believe in like sort of mandatory political participation. I believe in, I guess, that the government stepping in. And, I mean, we already have monopolies, right, that our government runs. Right now they're like privately outsourced, essentially. I believe that before we're going to have anything like socialism, our government's really going to have to necessarily take over necessary industries and make them state industries and run them as such before we can have full worker control over our industries and sort of a collapse of the need of a strong government infrastructure. So I do believe our government is going to need to eventually take over things like electricity and oil and water and, gas, healthcare, schooling entirely. Anything that we need to live, I do believe that there's going to need to be an equitable restructuring evenly between the people. And I think we're heading to a point in time where that's going to become necessary. If you just look at student debt, there's just no way that it's going to get paid. I mean, if you look at, it's arguable that they should have done that with the housing bubble before it burst. Maybe we wouldn't have, and they've done this already. They've done this with things like government bailouts, right? It's just right now, instead of the government paying for it, we're paying for it. Because it's not like they bailed them out and took over the industries. They bailed them out and gave them control to the same people who ran them into the ground. And that's a mistake we pay for.
Well, right now, it's like you said, the government ultimately is pretty much helping with make monopolies in certain industries, and that's
we have a welfare system. It's corporate welfare. That's our problem.
Well, if you look at what our economic policy actually resembles closest, it's absolutely not socialism. It's not laissez-faire, really. It's actually more of like what Mussolini described in of a corporatist economy, where the government and corporations work together, but corporate not work together.
Yeah.
Yeah, they work together in the interest of the people. They work together in the interest of themselves.
The interest of the corporation. It's corporate welfare system.
It's ultimately a form of fascism. It's fascism is ultimately what really our economic system resembles, and that's what I've labeled our government as for my entire time on the radio, and I've never backed away from saying it. So when it comes to, and I know what you're talking about, state control, nationalization of certain pertinent industries such as oil, food, perhaps. Is that, for my own political beliefs, I would call myself a socialist as well. However, I do believe that we do need to be cautious, and the people need to be heavily involved in any kind of transition and reboot of a government, just because of what's happened before in different countries where, like, for example, is that ultimately in the Soviet Union, the state control was never really relinquished, and there was a red oligarchy practically was formed. It was just
they didn't have enough resources in order to do so. I mean, by the time that you're having to let millions of people starve to death in order for you to call yourself a communist, you don't have the resources required to be a communist government. I mean, I would say that Russia was never a communist government. I mean, simply by the fact that they did not have enough wealth to redistribute to be such. In order for you to be a communist government, you have to have enough wealth to redistribute evenly amongst the masses in order for everybody to be essentially middle class, which we have enough wealth to do that. And I think right now we have exactly what you said, like a fascist government that is already like in line with monopolies, supporting those monopolies. They've already taken over those companies. They're already working essentially hand in hand with those companies. There's an oligarchy of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. If we were to take all of those companies right now, usurp them, and essentially turn them directly over for the good of the people right now, it literally wouldn't be anything but turning the product from the rich to the poor. I mean, I think that people really underestimate, like, how bad things are right now, how in bed corporations are with our government. That we already have exactly fascism.
There's an inherent fault in our system, our economic system, that ultimately was with capitalism / corporatism. There's the inherent fault is that you have stockholders. Well, it's really corporatism because you talk about corporations. We have stockholders, but stockholders expecting more and more money, and they're expecting growth every year. And the fact is that the corporation has to make more and more money each year to keep going, to keep its stockholders happy. The problem is that the prices keep going up and up and up, and the people's wages go down, down, down. Eventually, people can't afford the products that the corporations are producing, and the thing hits a paradox. It's just like one of those things that the ultimate end that happens in that it's an inevitable thing. People all the time talk about this paradox in socialism, where there'll be no more competition, thus no more drive for people to try to strive for more money, and people would not work at work, and then eventually the whole thing crumbles, and corporations have no benefit, or the people have no benefit to stay in the country, and all the corporations leave. Ultimately, though, I see ways around that. I don't see any ways around the stockholders demanding more money every year and demanding more things to be done, because ultimately, if a corporation makes $2 million of profits this year, the stockholders are going to expect more next year. If it stays the same and they see that it's stagnant, they're going to eventually want to pull out, and ultimately the corporation crumbles, or will demand a new CEO, demand a new commission, new chief financial officer, and all the top people would be demanded to leave. So ultimately, it's a paradox. Capitalism's ever expanding. It's like the Big Bang. And, capitalism itself, the idea of voluntarily trading, it's actually a pretty respectable idea, is that people barter for stuff that they need and everybody works together towards...
but we don't have that, like you said. We don't have... But
the thing is that ultimately it never ends up that way.
Yeah.
Is look at what we work, ultimately there's going to be, in the end, a few winners that monopolized, like what they did in this country, is that ultimately they took over our entire banking system. We have 4 banks controlling the entire banking system, which is the backbone of any capitalist/corporatist economy. And and we have in the Federal Reserve 10 families controlling they're the ultimate bank. They're the people that control our currency. So when you have the Federal Reserve privately owned by 10 families, and those 10 families are at the head of it, the Rothschild family, ultimately those people are going to be the ones that control your economy. Those people are the ones that are the ultimate winners, and everybody else will be losers eventually. Only them, the club, and the club that we're not in, like George Carlin described, the billionaires, whatever you call them, there's that club at the top that ultimately it's just for themselves. It's the welfare between them and their buddies. It's how billionaires can get taxes back. Companies like Boeing getting millions of dollars in tax reduction, or getting millions of dollars in tax refunds, rather than paying any kind of any kind of tax. You have these corporations that get all these deductions to where they're paying very little, or sometimes, like Boeing, getting money back in government subsidies, while we have people that are starving on the streets of many cities right now. In fact, we have the amount of people that are living on $2 or less a day, so we're pretty much talking about homeless people here, have quadrupled since 1996 as of last year.
And mostly in
20 years.
Mostly those numbers reflect family homelessness, the rise of family homelessness. We're not just even talking about, not that, young black men don't matter. That's absolutely, they still matter as a statistic, but what we're not talking about is teen moms, or we're talking whole families have lost their homes and are living in their cars. Anybody who is homeless matters, obviously. But when we see a rise in something as sharp as family homelessness, that means that these were people who had jobs, who had houses, who had mortgages, who were part of the economic fabric that makes up our vitality as an economic system. And when you see whole parts falling off like that, it should really send off warning bells to whether or not this economic system is sustainable. And of course, you and I believe that it's not.
No, this economic system is not viable, and right now we're starting to see the ugly symptoms of the end of it. As right now we're talking about abstract poverty actually becoming a reality in America, something that was pretty minimal in the past in the United States with abstract poverty. We had many people in poverty, but when people really can't afford to feed themselves, this is something that is a big problem in third world countries, a huger problem, of course, in Africa, but in America...
Because there isn't food. Because in places where there's drought and no food, it's not like we don't have food here. And so we won't give it to people. It's crazy.
Well, actually, I would argue that slightly, because actually Africa does have resources. They actually have they might be the most natural resource-rich country on the planet, but it's all robbed from them by multinational corporations that pretty much control most of those countries because of the colonial puppets that are in charge of practically every Africa.
Over farming and erosion and famine and drought and like things like, you know, GMOs, like making things not have enough variability. Yeah, I mean, we're on the same page with this, but it's just, it's not like there would not be, it's not like if things are left naturally alone. I mean, yes, you were correct, but in the invasion of colonial powers, they have raped and destroyed the lands of Africa in a very real way.
Well, you see what happened in Libya is that they had, when they had Muammar Gaddafi, that he actually brought the country to be in the richest country on the continent, and they actually were a pretty prosperous country prior to his removal, prior to the Civil War, which I'm going to say was 100% imported. This was not a natural grassroots revolution by any means, if you look into the real geopolitical nature of it. But Muammar Gaddafi, by removing European colonial interests from the country and a few other factors, and also by nationalizing his economy, he was actually moving towards trying to make a continent-wide nationalization, you know, trying to make an African Union using a continent-wide currency, the dinar, prior to his removal. But before that happened, it was like literally as he was about to roll that out, all of a sudden the Civil War breaks out and he's removed from power, which is odd because in 41 years the people didn't seem to have a problem with it, but all of a sudden in 2011 it's a massive problem. And all of a sudden, but in reality is that these people were paid mercenaries of NATO. NATO came there and bombed Libya for the second time. They tried in 1985, but they were unsuccessful. And then in 2011 they tried again with the help of paid mercenaries that they're paying people inside of Libya to fight, and also there was also legitimate people that were angry, but it was the spark. NATO provided the spark for it to happen. Is that they ultimately set the fire, and then people started running to the fire. Now they highly regret it 5-6 years later that the country is being overran by Islamic extremists, and at the same time is also fallen into massive poverty once again, like they were prior to Muammar Gaddafi, when they were a British colonial or neo-colonial interest under King Idris. Here in the United States, there's absolutely no excuse why we should have people in any kind of poverty, in any kind of abstract poverty, at least, when we have the top, we have 400, the top 400 people in America have 80% of the nation's wealth. So you can have people in a 747 jet, you know, and actually have a lot of rows empty, you know, with these 400 people. I mean, you can fit them easily on a jet plane. That's 80% of your country's wealth. And we have 325 million people in this country now, and the rest of them are fighting for the last 20%. And it's like the top 1% have over at least 99% of the nation's wealth. I believe it's something crazy like that. So it's like there's not even, you can see where, you know, imagine if just a few of those, you know, top oligarchs money, and I'll call them oligarchs. It's funny how America, when they're in other countries, these type of billionaires that are absolutely parasitic to an economy, they'll call them oligarchs and what they are. But here in America, they're just called billionaires or successful men. They're not successful. They're successful thieves. That's what they are. I don't have anything wrong with having a successful life and, you know, actually, you know, having a big house and you know, being a reasonably wealthy person. But when you become a billionaire, you're literally becoming parasitic on a population. You have so much wealth that many people have to be poor for you to be that rich. And what gain are you even receiving as a person to be that rich? There's only so much nice cars and nice houses that you can buy.
Yeah, it's like, why are you still playing the game to get more? Like, how much more do you need and why and for what? It's like there's something wrong with you, I feel like, after you hit, like, maybe, you know, enough money to sit on for the rest of your life, live comfortably, and you're still working. Why are you still working? Why? For accumulation? I don't know. It's like you meet those people, too, and they're the most unhappy people you've ever met in your life. It's like if I had a beach house, I would never have anything to complain about ever again. I don't understand. It sounds like, honestly, like a serious misery to be that wealthy, and a misery upon everyone else.
Honestly, I feel like half of that's probably, I think that some of these people just start to go slightly insane, and they think that enough money is going to make them immortal or something, which actually, the medical care that those people receive, I mean, look at like Henry Kissinger. He's 93 years old, and he's a fat pig. I mean, the dude's like 300-something pounds, and the dude's still around. I don't know how, it doesn't seem physically possible, but it looks like his face is rotting off. And, you know, people will probably say right now, isn't that a little bit mean you say that about Henry Kissinger? The dude's a war criminal. I have no problem calling him any name in the book. There's no word actually that can describe how vile of a man he is. And there's multiple people up in that club that definitely could be described in that nature. David Rockefeller was one of them. He was 101, and he made it that way through the rich people's, the billionaires' medical care. It's medical care that we haven't even heard of, and we have some ideas of what that kind of stuff is. You know, like apparently there's some like elite are paying for blood transfusions, like not because they actually need blood, it's because they just feel that apparently they believe if they inject younger people's blood, it will give them more vitality, which
and bone marrow transplants.
Yeah, they're doing stuff like that. It's not because they actually need it. It's not like they have cancer or that that's low on blood. It's just because they're trying to, squeeze in, I guess, a few more years via these. And they're pay, like I've seen cases where actually poor people, like I think it was UK, are like selling their blood in order to give to these rich people for their blood transfusion.
You can do that here. I mean, yeah, you can. I mean, I know a number of people here, young kids who sell their blood or their bone marrow or their eggs in order to just like make ends meet. That's crazy. It's crazy. It's just when you hear stuff like that, it's that's not right. When you have like Columbia graduates selling their blood to make rent, you're just like, warning bell, this economic system is not going to work. It's not working.
Yeah, it's like, it's funny how many like warning signs it's going to take until finally people, I don't think people are ever going to, in the masses, wake up, which it doesn't take that. Actually, that is a little bit of a misconception, I think, about a massive uprising to make massive change. It's not like, people are like, oh, well, we'll never be able to do something. It's like you're never going to get everyone to wake up. Well, we don't need 60% of the people to wake up. In fact, the American Revolution was done with 3% of the population, actually. And many massive uprisings have actually been done with a pretty small percentage. If you actually look into it, like less than 10% of the population. We don't need 60%. We don't need 40% to be out there, protesting in Washington, D.C. Even during like the Vietnam War protests, which I talk about because it's probably one of the few successful massive protests that have actually happened. And I don't think it was anywhere near. It probably wasn't anywhere close to 10% or part of it. In fact, there was a lot more people that were trying to say, "Oh, those people are just being unpatriotic. They need to respect our soldiers." When actually a lot of the soldiers were a part of the protest, and I think that's where the group Veterans for Peace originated, which are former soldiers that advocate for peace and diplomacy rather than war after war after war. It
was hundreds of thousands of draft resistors, 10,000 of which was as much as they could afford to prosecute. I mean, that's the thing is, what it comes down to is being able to overwhelm the systems that are set up to essentially, like, squash dissent. So you've got to have, like, jail no bail that is so big that folks are no longer able to be held by the jailing system. Or you've got to have so many people resisting a draft that it's no longer able to, like, prosecute draft resistors. Or, you've got to have, like, a need in a time where it's so necessary for there to be more forces, such as like World War II, that you have to integrate the army because you don't have enough people, or that women are just voting anyway, and in such great numbers that you cannot afford to keep women from voting any longer. And, I think the problem with the way that people think about social movements is they think all of a sudden there's going to be an avalanche. And that's not how it works. It's a lot of build and a lot of build and a lot of build. And then the system that cannot hold the weight of dissent anymore collapses. And a lot of the time, in fact, when that happens, you get a rebuilding of something that is still not what you wanted, and so it's also like working in the aftermath to like rebuild policies. I mean, that's what we're looking at with collapse of slavery, and then you have the new Jim Crow, and then the collapse the collapse of slavery, and then the Jim Crow, the collapse of the Jim Crow sort of, and the rise of the new Jim Crow, and the prison industrial complex. It's like, you can't just, like, free people, like, work to free the oppressed and then just walk away. That's what happened in Afghanistan, and look how much that's screwing us over today. You can't just liberate folks and, and I don't even believe in, like, this construct of, like, colonial liberation, but, like, you can't just show up and do the right thing because it's economically sound and then walk away from it. Like, these folks don't have cultural capital or power or legitimacy. Like, you have to rebuild people's lives from the inside out.
Yes.
Yep.
I love that that notion. Yeah, talk about the colonial liberation and the people. Again, and that's what they like to portray America as a liberator, and ultimately we're not really liberating anything at this. And nothing. After World War II, every war has been about the first part colonialism, but there's been no liberation. They try to put that line about South Vietnam or North Vietnam, that we're going to liberate North Vietnam, or that we're going to liberate Vietnam from communism. We're going to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein. We're going to liberate.
I think in the moment that the United States gets involved in a, quote, liberation campaign, you're already enslaved. Like, the moment where your best bet is the moment that you are most certainly enslaved to the economic wins of the United States. You have now joined our arsenal of chess pieces to be used at will for us and against your aims. Like, I am definitely an isolationist. For that purpose, for that reason. I think if you're so bad off that America is your best hope, it's better off for you to fight for yourself and win or lose on your own merits, because you're going to spend the rest of your lives being indebted to a country like America. And I wouldn't wish that I'm like my worst enemy.
Well, most of the countries have actually been so-called liberated by the United States. I mean, there's been, like I said, is that, Kissinger, when he, I think the mainstream picture of things, and when it comes to what happened in 1973 in Chile, they'll try to say that Chile was, at least at the time, I think they're trying to say that Chile was liberated from communism. But actually, it was put into a horrible fascist dictatorship under Pinochet. That's what happened under many different circumstances. That's what happened when they. That's what happened in multiple different African countries, and this is mainly like CIA interventions, and also times when you have military.
I think it'd be hard pressed to find any country that has benefited from U.S. aid. Like,
yeah, Iraq.
Iraq. It's double plus not good.
Yeah, it's like even Iraq. Is that yes, they had ultimately Saddam Hussein was an absolute horrible, sadistic, evil leader, and so was his family. Well, at least his son Uday. But when they were eliminated, now ISIS came into the picture as the country fell into chaos and there was a power vacuum that was never really filled. They put in the weak transitional government. Ultimately, ISIS, which I'll say is a CIA Western construct, was unleashed on the Iraqi population. Now, and also, you have to remember one thing about Saddam Hussein, he wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for American help, because remember who we helped in the Iraq-Iran war. We helped both sides secretly. We sold arms to the Iranians, but the main person that we officially supported, the main people that we helped become the man that he was Saddam Hussein. We gave him the weapons for him to gas the Kurds. He gassed the Kurds with Washington, D.C.'s approval. He actually invaded Kuwait, and they pretty much had a green light from the United States. Then he decided, then the United States decided they were against that after the Kuwaitis made a big fuss about it. I guess they were hoping that they'd go down the struggle or something, because it was like two allies fighting against each other, and then they decided, okay, we're going to pick Kuwait because they're the more richer and more oil-rich ally, and we need them more than we need Iraq. That's pretty much what it came down to in the State Department in Washington, D.C.
Our listeners who aren't really familiar with that backstory, and oh my God, it is convoluted. And I'm not saying that there's an easy way to navigate it, but there is an entertaining one that has been said to be pretty historically accurate, and giving you a sense of what the whole background to this entire mess in the Middle East. We perpetuated Charlie Wilson's War, gives a really strong insight into the back politics that led to, the intergenerational mess we are living with today, and destroying other people on the basis of, more importantly, right? We've inserted ourselves into this situation for our own economic gain, and it has cost American lives, but it's nothing compared to how much we have destroyed whole communities and whole societies and whole countries.
Yeah, well, that's ultimately where modern terrorism pretty much started in the 1970s, 1980s Afghanistan, which Mujahideen, they pretty much all spawned off that organization, and America provided aid for them against the Soviet-backed Afghani government, which eventually, and the Soviet Union did enter Afghanistan, and they were fighting against the Mujahideen. But let's remember that they were invited by the government of Afghanistan, unlike when we entered into Syria, or many times when America showed up, it wasn't that we were invited. We just showed up, but they showed up invited to Afghanistan to deal with their terrorist problem. And later on, the group turns into the Taliban. Taliban turns into Al-Qaeda. Pretty much everything spawns off the Mujahideen. In the 1990s, the Mujahideen pretty much formed into the Taliban, and then later turned into the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan in the late 90s.
It all stems from this idea that, we helped rid, quote, the terrorists, and then walked away, leaving a country completely destitute, completely destroyed. Its industries and facilities completely in crumbles. And that was kind of what, the movie sort of talks about is, and I guess Charlie Wilson, who's, we would not say he's progressive by any means, but we would say he warned the government that this is what was going to happen if we just walked away from this situation without rebuilding anything. And while they were totally content to, quote, rid the terrorists and gain access to oil reserves and oil deals, etc., they did not put any financial stock in rebuilding that country to make it a functioning power. That wasn't the reason why we were there. Our government said, we have our oil deals, we have our relationship, we have our resources. We don't need to pour any more money into this situation. It's totally a mess of our own making.
Yeah, and ultimately a government that seems like, with the rules that they imposed on their people, sounds like something from the 1600s when the Taliban took over and the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan became a thing. But ultimately, we didn't have really a problem with Afghanistan until 2000, when all of a sudden, when Mohammed Omar, the leader of Afghanistan, told everybody that he was banning opium, from Afghanistan, and he cracked down on the poppy plant, or the poppy growers, and then ultimately 75% of the world's opium disappeared, and 99% of Afghanistan's opium disappeared. By the way, the audio is coming real scratchy from one of our sides. I think it might be on your end. I'm not sure if you're moving the mic or something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm actually, at this point, I'm supposed to be leading a reading group this evening, and so I'm trying to sort of figure out the transition into that. I apologize. I got so caught up in this conversation I didn't realize I'd been on for an hour and 34 minutes, and I have about a half an hour to prepare for this reading group tonight for Ideas for Action by Cynthia Kaufman.
Yeah, sounds great. Here's the deal. If you need to get ready, you need to do what you do. You can leave a few minutes early. You can leave at any time, honestly. It's been great having you on the show. If you want to stay around till the top of the hour, that's also cool. But yeah, it's only 20 minutes left of the show, actually, or at least the part that's going to go on.
It's 2 hours. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought it was an hour long. My bad. I totally got my.
It was kind of. I know it was kind of weird trying to get everything figured out. You know, it was like at first we were trying to get the time zone figured out and all that, but it was too.
Yeah, I could hang out if you need. Yeah, I mean we can finish up.
You want? Okay, cool. That's awesome. Yeah, at 6 o'clock, that's when the show will end, or at least I could go technically further, but that's all it's going to go on to the UCY.TV. That's all it can fit on. That's my time slot. Like I have a 2-hour time slot, 9 to 11 on Sundays, that goes on to the UCY TV, which is
very
a bigger
cool
network. Yeah. When you came on 3 years ago, actually, it was only right here on Blog Talk Radio. It's a really cool network. You should check it out. There's actually the Anti-Media Radio is actually like the big page that you see on Facebook that has like a few million likes. They do the radio show out of UCY.TV. They're on 5 nights a week. There's a few people that are kind of like well-known in the alternative media. That's what it ultimately is. It's like it is the alternative media ultimately, but it's some of the most well-known alternative media hosts. And then there's some people that don't, there's like a wide variety of topics. People specialize on different things. Like there's one guy that's Michael, does primer time. He specializes on firearms and stuff like that. Like he's a gun enthusiast, but he also is pretty political. And then there's other people talk about all kinds of more single issue stuff, and then you have the general people like me that have the widest varieties you almost can imagine inside of politics. I've had, like I said, on the same network, I've had you, Rosalind Fuller from RT, had like a Black Panther type guy, had a
very
guy
cool.
from Bundy. Yeah, it's a wide variety of guests. There's probably I'm pretty sure if there's a guy right now if there's a guy specialized to watching me in the NSA, probably really fucking confused of what is this guy about?
Wow, that sounds extremely varied.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If they would try to go by my guest or even by the many different political topics, and I may have changed my opinions on a couple of stuff, they probably would be slightly confused. I'm going to ask, another pretty important question. So, what are your main projects that you're working on now or recently? Because it's been 3 years since I've had you on the show. So, what have been major things you've been working on?
I published a book with The Nation, a memoir, The Emancipation of Cecilly Mcmillan, and it really attempts to track my political involvement through really a very normative pathway, just trying to figure out what it means to be a political participant as an everyday millennial. It led me to sort of activism and with the big intent to not only normalize activism, but also to provide a face and a character to the many women behind bars, and beyond just a face or a character, to argue that they're some of the most impressive beings I've ever come into contact with. So to really give people an accessible inlet to understanding who exactly is behind bars. So that took a while. And then, I was involved in the Resist Strikers movement and have been continually involved in that. I am also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm a board member on the Executive Council at Metro Atlanta DSA here in Atlanta. And doing a lot of work on grassroots elections, and that's where we're working on the education working group right now with sort of getting millennials who have been sort of radicalized in the post-Trump election, figuring out how to navigate political education, theoretical education, give folks like the very basic toolbox to be able to navigate the political world around them with a pretty decent analysis, but something that translates easily into praxis. Getting kids involved in prison support efforts and bailout efforts, Black Mama's bailout campaign to bail Black mothers out of prison. That was a Mother's Day initiative. LGBTQ initiatives, the Fight for 15 in Atlanta. So yeah, Metro DSA is pretty much a coalition group, and it's about trying to get our extensive, vast membership, as of especially doubling since the Trump election, really activated towards long-term projects. It's been a big role, and otherwise just working one by one on being available to help with court support and prison support, and helping folks to get paired up with lawyers, and navigating appeals still, and trying to figure out what the civil case looks like in the event that the appeal doesn't really work out, which we did lose our first round of the appeals recently. And I just got off probation a couple weeks ago, so that really frees up some opportunity. Just starting to be able to be like a whole active person again. I mean, felony probation is no joke.
And the event happened, you said, 2000, was it March 2012, July, or was May?
March 2012.
March 2012, and you just got off of probation, how long ago? A couple weeks, few weeks ago, you said?
Yeah, and I was released actually 2 years early, maybe as a consolation prize for them denouncing my appeal in unprecedented speed, all through deliverance. So
it was
pretty bad.
You got this gigantic, gigantic punishment awarded for ultimately, in the end, just protesting, being an activist. I mean, and they tried to they were trying to trump it up almost as domestic terrorism when you've had people that have literally committed, you have people that have committed violent crimes, that had, that were rich and had good enough lawyers and got completely off or got lighter sentences than you got. It just shows how broken the justice system is. I want to go to, so you said you're part of the Democratic Socialist of America. Is it its own party, or is it like affiliated with the Socialist Party USA, or what? or is it its own thing?
No, we don't believe in creating our own party. We believe in, so Bernie Sanders is an honorary member of Democratic Socialists of America. We believe in supporting candidates with progressive ideals who will run as a part of the existing structure. So we're not really, it's not like we don't support socialist candidates, because we definitely do. But we don't believe that our efforts would be well spent towards trying to create an additional political party, is kind of what I mean.
So this is the thing, though, is that ultimately here comes the big dilemma between me and, I guess you could say, the mainstream Democratic Socialist or Socialist of America. A lot of them, the people that supported Bernie Sanders, that to me, Bernie Sanders, I could never support someone still in support of the United States war machine. He was still in support of action towards Iran. He was still in support of action against the Assad government in Syria. He was still in support of imperialist actions, and at the same time, he supported, even though he might have been critical about some of the actions that Israel
do you pay taxes?
Huh?
Do you pay taxes?
Yeah, I pay taxes.
Yeah, do you pay taxes?
Yeah.
Well, then you're in support of the war machine. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is it's an unavoidable truth of our current reality. And Tolstoy, The Kingdom of God is within you. His book really outlines a way to be completely nonviolent as a lifestyle, but it would require you to do things like strategically not pay taxes and not accept any support from the state. I'm not hearing what you're saying, but I support Bernie, but I have my own criticisms for different reasons. But ultimately, there's not going to be a presidential candidate who, it's not possible to have someone.
The focus on is we can't focus on candidates because the whole system is broken. There'll never be, the elite will never allow a president, and I'm going to say to be selected, not to be elected, because there is no real elections anymore, to be elected or selected, whatever you call it, that goes against their agenda. This is the 1960s anymore. Kennedy can't be elected again, and ultimately we're going to be stuck with people like Trump, Clinton, and I think it's just going to keep getting progressively worse. As we went from Obama, Romney, now we have Trump, Clinton. I can just imagine what 2020 is going to be, if there even is an election in 2020. When it comes to Bernie Sanders, is that the difference between me paying taxes and him, Bernie Sanders, he literally vocally supporting in debates rather than standing up and saying, I'm not in support of any action towards Iran. They are not committing illegal acts that you're suggesting, like making a nuclear weapons program that there's no proof that they are making. This is something that Israel's been claiming for 25 years, but there's no real proof of it. They've been saying they're 6 months away from a nuclear weapon since the 80s, I think. And Netanyahu's been claiming it since 1991, but we're going to still listen to this clown? This clown has been telling America that for the last 25 years, and it has never been true. And all they've been doing is actually been committing acts of terrorism against the Iranian state and been attacking the Iranian nuclear scientists and such and provoking the situation, not the other way around. And same thing with Syria is that you should up and say, no, I'm not in support of exacerbating the situation that America caused by being Salafist terrorists inside of Syria, and by attacking the Assad government, allowing effectively these Wahhabi terrorists and ISIS would take over if Assad goes. The moderate rebel is a myth of Western media and has not been shown to be any bit of a reality. There might have been at the beginning of the war, but they have been absorbed by extremist groups since then. Also, when it comes to Israel, is that he might have made some criticisms about Israel, but he did not. But when people approached him about why he still was in support of Israel and the Israeli-Palestine situation, he ignored him. He told him to get the hell out of his, well, I don't know what the
Of course he did.
told him. He told him to shut up and leave.
But of course he did. Of course he did. I mean, it's just, ultimately, the 2 points that you've just made, to make those publicly in a race for the United States president would effectually rule you out as a candidate. I mean, there would be no sense in running if you meant to step out and say those things. And it's not that I agree with it, and it's certainly why I wouldn't run for president, but, I mean, that's the reality. That's just, you got the most progressive candidate that we've had probably since Jimmy Carter, and those are 2 battles that he was never going to be able to step up on. It's not even a possibility. You become unelectable. But on the other hand, I'm inclined to agree with you because I don't think his position ever was one to attempt to get elected. I don't think that's why I don't think he actually wanted to get elected. I don't think he wanted to be the person who had to go back on everything he said publicly because the position wouldn't allow it. So why didn't he just go ahead and say those things if he had no intent on getting elected? I don't know why. But if your intent...
Yeah, you remind me of the board...
You can't say anything that you just said. You can't run for president.
Well, and that also reminds me of the end is that he was talking, 6 weeks prior to his dropping out of the election, he was saying how Hillary Clinton was a Wall Street puppet like she is and is very bad for the working class and that she is not the progressive or, working class supporter that she claims she is. But as soon as that he drops out of the election, he's reversing all the things. All these criticisms that he had about Hillary all of a sudden no longer are there. That's the thing is that he ultimately just sheepdogged for Hillary, and there's no one's going to tell me, no matter what, that there was any meaningful difference between Hillary and Trump. When it comes to the people outside of our borders, there's no meaningful difference. Even inside our borders, I don't think there's much meaningful difference. In the end, all of it comes to a wash. The outside of our borders, people are still going to be bombed by our military under both those candidates, and even under Bernie, according to his official statement. The last presidential candidate that wouldn't have been the case would have been Ron Paul because he was a non-interventionist and actually an isolationist, some would argue. Trump, they called him an isolationist, but you hear his foreign policy, and it wasn't an isolationist foreign policy, and you see what he's doing right now. It's still of being the world police. It's still killing innocent people because they have a regime that we don't like, because they're doing something that's not in our game. They're not playing ball. We have to be the mafia of the world. And that anybody who doesn't play ball with us and doesn't want to be an associate of the Don now has to be attacked by the Don. We're the Don Corleone of international politics. And
that's where our leverage lies, for sure. I mean, I think that all of this scaremongering is in an effort to keep that industrial, military machine alive. That's like, you've got to justify spending so much of our budget towards keeping this thing up and running. And so you scaremonger in order to legitimize excessive spending. And then the person who becomes the President of the United States, therefore becomes essentially the commander-in-chief of a killing, raping, stealing machine in efforts to sustain, allegedly, the American people, but really to sustain the capitalist cause. I do have to go right now. I'm so sorry.
That's the timing. It is 5:58 right now, so we got our entire 2 hours in, pretty much. So thanks for coming on the show. It was great having you on.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the confusion.
Oh, it's awesome. We made it work, and that was great having you on after 3 years. Okay. By the way, to all the listeners right now, looks like we're nearing the end, and to all the people at UCYD.TV who are listening, thanks everyone. Tune in to tonight's show, or if you're listening live here at Stable, I guess this afternoon's show. We will be back next Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern for all the people listening at UCY. By the way, check out my Facebook page, Chris Jackson Rojas. I occasionally do podcasts from there. So if you want to get more of my radio, that's where you want to go. And by the way, stay vigilant, stay informed.
Thanks for having me.
My name